Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. Before we begin, I'd like to mention an online event that I'm hosting this weekend called A Bookish Weekend with the Tudors. Over the weekend of the 28th and 29th of September, we'll explore 16th century printing, books and manuscripts through a series of 6 lectures and 1 live Zoom discussion delivered by experts in this field. Joining me are Jo Saunders, Dr. Owen Emerson, Kate McCaffrey, Dr. Rebecca Quose-Moore, Professor Martine van Elk and Dr. Vanessa Wilkie. This is unmissable for lovers of books and Tudor history. For details and to reserve your place, click on the link in the show notes or just Google A Bookish Weekend with the Tudors. Be quick though, as ticket sales end soon. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Amy Jeffs to the podcast to chat about her new book, Saints, a New Legendary of Heroes, Humans and Magic. Dr. Jeffs is an author, artist and medievalist. During her PhD in art history at the University of Cambridge, she co-convened a project researching medieval pilgrim souvenirs at the British Museum. She then worked in the British Library's Department of Ancient, Medieval and Early Modern Manuscripts. Now a Somerset-based author, she illustrates her books. Storyland, A New Mythology of Britain was published in 2021. It was a Sunday Times bestseller and a Waterstones Book of the Month, as well as being shortlisted for Waterstones Book of the Year. Wild, Tales from Early Medieval Britain was published in 2022. Its audiobook, which included 7 original songs co-written and performed by Amy, was named Audiobook of the Week by The Guardian and The Times. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Amy. How are you?
I'm really well. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Maybe if we could just start with an introduction, you just telling us a little bit about you and your background.
Yes. So my name's Amy. I'm a medievalist by trade, art historian, but I began my higher education with early medieval Northwestern European languages and literature, and also the production of manuscripts. I was very interested in that. I did a very, very niche course at the University of Cambridge, undergraduate course called Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic. And so I did Old English language and literature, Old Norse language and literature, and medieval Latin, and codicology and paleography, so the history of bookmaking, and for the whole manuscript period of handmade books from their kind of genesis up to the printing press, really, and script history, so looking at medieval script systems and different hierarchies of script, because it was very formalized. And in my third year, I jumped across to history of art to pursue a study of medieval art, especially metalwork from the early medieval period and manuscript illumination. And that's then, I was still very much in an early period at that point. But for my master's, I moved into the Romanesque period, did making and meaning in medieval art at the Courtauld Institute of Art. And I ended up doing my dissertation on a about a 14th century manuscript. When I say on a 14th century manuscript, it often sounds like I've vandalized something in a public collection. But I didn't write it on a manuscript. And then I continued studying that, researching that manuscript along with other 14th century English illuminated manuscripts for my PhD. And I was very interested in the contents of these manuscripts, obviously, but they happen to be sort of origin myths of Britain, origin stories being in translation for a Norman Plantagenet sort of elite or ruling classes often, and sort of presenting a view of the deep history of Britain that supported the imperial ambitions of the contemporary ruling classes. And this remains relevant well into the Tudor period as well. This was a mythic history, then perceived as history proper, of giants and prophesying goddesses and Trojans that really connected Britain, this puny little island at the edge of the known world with no good stories to its name. But of course it did have some, but not ones written down by apostles or classical authors, connected this island to the center of the map, the world map as it was perceived then, to the biblical and classical heartlands. And so this story gave real kudos to, it was known as the Brute legend. So anyway, this is what I got into when I was working on my PhD, and I was sort of suddenly aware of that these stories were really actually good stories in their own right, exciting stories. So I started illustrating them with lino cut illustrations. And that turned into a series of articles for Country Life magazine, which then on Britain's mythic topography, which then turned into a book proposal, which became my first book, Storyland, A New Mythology of Britain. Then I did a smaller book called Wild Tales from Early Medieval Britain, which went back to my early studies of the earlier period and the kind of very mysterious Old English elegies and Welsh and Glynion and very curious, heavily narrative objects like the whale's bone Frank's casket. And now I have just received yesterday my box of author copies of Saint, a new legendary of heroes, humans and magic, which is really rooted. I didn't actually mention while I was doing my PhD, this is actually crucial to the current book. I was working in the British Museum on a research project about medieval pilgrim souvenirs and secular badges. Badges, ES, not badgers, which is one of the constant issue. People, old school friends would think I was digitizing medieval badges. But these amazing pilgrim souvenirs especially often depicted saints who were venerated at the time and moments from their legends. And many of them had been found in the foreshores of the Thames in the Victorian period and collected for the British Museum. And so I became really fascinated by the idea of these little, very lowly lead alloy cues for narrative that were just in the mud of London, in their hundreds, in their thousands. I mean, there's there's over 730 in the British Museum, secular and sacred iconographies, and similar numbers, if not more, in the Museum of London. And then we find them also in Bristol, appear in Bristol Harbour. They found the Purfleet in King's Lynn, also in the old medieval sewers in Salisbury, and they've gone into the collection at Salisbury. Then they've got hundreds too. And that these stories, I just suddenly was really excited about these stories and being able to read these images. And so that sort of got me, planted the seed for this, sowed the seed for this idea of writing a book about saints' legends, about this amazing storytelling culture where the tales are not, they're far more unruly and unofficial than maybe we assume, that many of their subjects are completely legendary, not at all historical, that their structures and form have a lot in common with fairy tale and folklore, and that we don't know these stories not because they aren't interesting or intimately connected. Many of them, have sort of spin-off stories that connect them intimately to the British landscape or the Northwestern European landscape, even though that these stories were actively suppressed in the Protestant Reformation. And so we lost them as a result of an authoritarian regime, not because they aren't super cool. And so I have chosen a number of 30 or so stories for this book. I've retold them as fiction, going through the year January to December, according to the date of the Saint's feast day. And then I've written a commentary that comes after each story, sort of placing that saint in context. Some of them are native to, and some of them are kind of imported. But it also tells the story of the rise and fall of the medieval cult of saints all the way up to the Protestant Reformation and the destruction of the shrines. And for me, it's just a really exciting story about the push and pull of popular fervor versus the kind of orthodox theology which is a changing thing throughout the history of the church, but how the cult of saints didn't really sit easy for the whole period for which the medieval cult of saints existed. So yeah, that's me, and that's my work. And Saints is out on the 12th of September, and I'm really excited to have it finally and to take it around to bookshops and talk about it and meet people.
Yeah, that sounds so exciting. And your work and your studies sound absolutely fascinating. So I wanted to ask you, Amy, a little bit more about saints. So in case our listeners haven't really studied this area very much, what role did they actually play in medieval Christian world?
In the really early period where missionary work is still happening, where people like Boniface, who is living in the 8th century, I believe, he's going into places like Frisia where people aren't yet Christian. And those kinds of missionaries found relics to be very effective. I mean, the cult of saints was already in motion at this point. After the persecution of the Christians under the Romans, there wasn't a formal canonization process, but there were heroic deaths that were recognized by the Christian communities within the Roman Empire, and those communities had begun venerating the tombs of those who had been killed and who had refused to renounce their faith under torture or whatever else that was pressures placed on them. And so already there was a kind of cult of martyrs. And this veneration of bones, of their bones or of bones of holy figures from the Bible, enabled missionaries to kind of transport body parts into unconverted territories. And these were just a particularly effective way of, I guess, a kind of a focal point or a religious object that inspired people's imaginations, and that relic veneration seemed to be an effective missionary tool. And so there's an amazing letter from Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century to Bishop Mellitus, the first Bishop of London. He's an Italian man, probably. And Pope Gregory the Great says, don't destroy the old temples. Take out the furnishings and replace them with altars and relics of the saint. And don't stop the people from killing animals, but stop them from sacrificing them to the old gods. But you can keep killing animals on the dedication day of that saint or the feast day of that saint, and you can have eat the animal as part of the celebrations around that. And so you see how relic veneration is not only a tool for conversion, it also then becomes part of the way in which Christianity is assimilated into the lives of people who hadn't been practicing Christianity for most of their lives, and it sort of allows that integration to take place. And the idea of this person who died on a particular day, and it gives you particular days on which to celebrate and have festivities. But by the later period, they have become, there's an interesting, initially it's all about relics, the veneration of relics. We zoom forward quite a few hundred years. There's then a shift from needing to visit a saint's relics in order to experience that sanctity or to be touched by that sanctity, to the veneration of images of the saint. And actually the relics become less important. And this is a very crucial thing in the build up to the Reformation, this line between what is idolatry and the role of images in that. People would have experienced saints, therefore, in the form of relics, in the form of images, not only kind of panel paintings or conventional paintings as we think of them on a separate board, but also narrative imagery painted onto the walls of churches and into secular buildings as well. And many other kinds of media, sort of the outsides of ecclesiastical buildings, it may be also in manuscripts or on tiles like slipware was a very popular form of narrative imagery or medium for narrative imagery. And then they would have also had the legends. Some of them are, because on a saint's feast day, the churches would, and in abbeys and things, they would read the saint's legend, and they might read it in some settings, it might be read in Latin, but also households, but by the later Middle Ages, when the laity were much more literate than especially the higher echelons of society were able to read, they might have collections of legends called legendaries, like the South English Legendary, which are written in Middle English and would have been, and are in, very readable verse, entertaining, very dramatic, really good kind of the original period drama for a Sunday night for the family to consume. And so I think it's what this book made me realize. And of course, pilgrim souvenirs and badges and images like that, is that saints were everywhere in medieval Christian Europe. This was just part of life It was part of, I mean, just the oaths that people swore and taking, you say, by St. Martin it would just been everywhere constantly, and daily references and that sort of things. And I will also say and then the taking the mick out of it too, because medieval Christians had a really good sense of humor. And so that kind of inversion, I talk about the difference between inversion and subversion in the book. They take the mick out of it, not to undermine the saints or the cult of saints, but to undermine gullible pilgrims or, the silliness of some aspects of the cult of saints, because it does verge on the ridiculous quite a lot. And I think there was a consciousness of that. So it's just everywhere.
And in terms of how these cults of saints spread, was it mainly through these relics being transported or moved, or were there other ways that people found out about this?
Well, I think the power of the stories is a big part of it. So you've got the relics of St. Cuthbert at Durham Cathedral, but you've also, within 50 years of his death, 50 or so years of his death, you've got the Venerable Bede writing the first life of Cuthbert, or the first surviving one, where it describes his nightly immersions in the sea and his prayer in this freezing cold water away from his hermitage on Farne Island, and then getting out of the sea and then standing there just to dry in the wind, and the otters coming out of the sea and winding themselves around his ankles to dry his feet. And that these stories are the intangible dimension to the surviving built heritage that we have, or the artifacts like Cuthbert's coffin or like Durham Cathedral. Durham itself wouldn't be there in this form if it weren't for the cult of St. Cuthbert. But it's really is all about, to my mind, the power of the story of the hermit that is so desperate for his solitude that he, when he's at the end of his life, offered the chance to become the Bishop of Hexham, the honour. He says, he really doesn't want to go that far inland. He's living out on this island beyond Lindisfarne on a little hermitage surrounded by sea birds and marine animals. And he says, I'll swap, if I suppose I should, do my duty, but I'll become Bishop of Lindisfarne, and the current Bishop of Lindisfarne, he can go and be the Bishop of Hexham. And so he does that for a couple of years, but it eventually just goes back to his hermitage, can't bear to be away. And within a year, he's died out in his hermitage. With that compounded with the otters, and it's just a very moving story of holiness and dedication to hard life, to ascesis, that kind of exercise and prayer and all of that. I think that's really what is powering the monks, their devotion to Cuthbert, and they're taking his relics away from the Viking incursions to Chester-le-Street, where they rest for a while, and then on to Durham. And the foundation of the cult there. Then his coffin was opened at least twice, and they find various objects in there, like a gospel book that's now in the British Library, a Gospel of St. John, and from his made an early medieval product with the earliest surviving intact Western binding. Not that it was then, but it is now. Yeah, it's just I think it's their stories. I think it's the power of the stories and that's also comes across in the pilgrim souvenirs, the way in which they just like trigger one, like what Thomas Becket ones I often show. There are many, many different iconographies for Thomas Becket pilgrim souvenirs, and one shows him returning from exile on his horse just before it all kicks off again and Henry's knights come in to attack him in the cathedral. And you can just imagine people saying, oh, that's that bit in the story, or that's, I think these were familiar.
And so, Amy, could you tell us a little bit about who the most popular saints were in the 15th and 16th centuries? I know lots of the Tudor queens, for example, associated themselves with certain saints, usually named saints. But yeah, that would be wonderful if you could tell us a bit about that.
For sure. So one thing I find, actually, I'm going to find this in the book because it's right next to me, and then I'll definitely get it right, because there was a very popular group of saints, 11,000 saints, led by Ursula. Ursula was said to have been a British princess who was Christian, but she was betrothed to a pagan prince. And she said, I'll marry him if I'm allowed to go on pilgrimage to Rome and take 11 noble women, and each of them I'm going to get my maths really confused here. They go 1,000, they each take 1,000 or something servants. Anyway, it ends up with 11,000 of them. That's the answer to the complex sum I'm trying to do. And they do this pilgrimage to Rome, and they accrue even more people, more followers, till there's 26,000 of them, according to the Golden Legend, which was a really popular compendium of saints' legends that circulated in Europe from the 13th century and North Africa, I should say, not just Europe. Then they come back from their pilgrimage and they stop at Cologne, and Cologne is invaded by the Huns, and they all receive martyrdom except for one, Cordula, who hides in one of their boats, but then comes out the next morning and is like, sorry, I hid. And then she gets martyred too. And so their feast days are the 20th of October for 10,999 of them. And then Cordula's feast days on the 21st of October because he hid. But they were very popular. And it was said that obviously there was tons and tons of relics for the 11,000 virgins. But it was said that if an imposter relic got in, it would be miraculously ejected. And reliquary busts of these very pious late medieval noble women were all over the courts of Europe and the monasteries. And one thing I found very interesting in relation to Tudor dynasty is regarding Catherine of Aragon and her arrival. I'm just going to read a paragraph or two, if that's all right. From the book,
please do.
So in the November of 1501, England welcomed a Spanish princess called Catherine of Aragon. When her ship had docked at Southampton, she had been accompanied by 11 English women of the upper nobility, all dressed alike, along with a larger company of knights' wives. They were intended to make Catherine look like Ursula with her 11,000 virgins. On London Bridge, they met another St. Ursula tableau. Catherine then processed through the streets of London to her betrothed, Prince Arthur Tudor, the brother of the future King Henry VIII. Thus, embodied by Catherine and Arthur, the legendary British princess would marry the legendary British warlord. Pageantry elevated both figures and made one into an honorary Briton. The pageantry surrounding Catherine's arrival in England shows yet again how saints' legends could help convey politically important ideas. But Arthur would die young, and she would marry his brother, the future King Henry VIII. He starts to change his mind about how politically useful saints' legends are. I thought that was amazing how there's also like a thing that we can easily forget is these sort of live performances inspired by saints' legends and the political function of them. And it took a long time after the sort of main events of the Reformation for the mystery plays to be suppressed, because this was such a popular civic event across England and Britain at large, where guilds would come together and stage different parts of liturgical dramas and saints' legends. There's a really amazing Reformation poem by a reformer. It gives an insight as well into what a late medieval town centre might have looked like on a piece like the Corpus Christi when it was very popular to put on plays. So this is Thomas Nauergerg, The Popish Kingdom, written in 1570. Christ's passion here derided is with sundry masks and plays. Fair Ursula with maidens all doth pass amid the ways. And valiant George, with spear thou killest the dreadful dragon here. The devil's house is drawn about, wherein there doth appear a wondrous sort of damned sprites with foul and fearful look. Great Christopher doth wade and pass with Christ amid the brook. Sebastian full of feathered shafts the dint of darts doth feel. There walketh Catherine with her sword in hand and cruel wheel. The chalice and the singing cake with Barbara is led, and sundry other pageants played in worship of this bread. So I think we've got Catherine there, we've got St. Christopher. He's a super popular one, and there's over 130 surviving wall paintings of St. Christopher in parish churches in England and Wales that show him gigantic. I mean, I think he's in a really like slightly corny way, the original BFG, that appeal of giants who are everywhere else. Giants are mean and scary and threatening. But Christopher, he begins the story as his name is Reprobatus, reprobate or scoundrel, but he ends up carrying the Christ child across the river. And despite the increasing weight of the Christ child to the point that it's as heavy as the whole world, he manages to get across and put the child safely down on the other side, at which point the child reveals himself as Christ and says, and you did carry the weight of the world because that's what I bore when I died for humankind. And this is often depicted. This moment with the child on his shoulders and the rising water. And he's always huge. This is the moment he's becoming the official friendly giant. And you go into church and it's really amazing. He's often right in front of the south door as you come in, sort of on the opposite wall. So it's the first thing you see, this enormous giant just becoming the goodie that he's going to be. There was sometimes accompanied with an inscription that translates very roughly as, if you look on Christopher today, you will not die. And so there was this belief in his like talismanic power. Saint Catherine, I think, is such an intriguing saint. She was very, very popular. The ones with the really dramatic and distinctive martyrdoms seem to become especially popular in the late Middle Ages. She is a philosopher and she vanquishes all the philosophers in the Roman Empire with her rhetoric and her ability to to argue and her wisdom. I think one thing that I was quite interested in the writing of this book was whether she was a kind of feminist icon, because that's where our minds go, I think, straight away is, oh, you know, how intriguing. One of the most popular saints was a young girl who is really, really well educated and really brilliant. And you think then, okay, so, you know, we know she was a very popular saint for women. Is that because they are seeing her as a role model? And I think the answer is probably not. You know, this is a time in which I think one of the things we assume about saints, especially if anyone listening is a practicing Catholic, and I was raised Catholic, you know, saints are presented as role models, but this isn't the case in the Middle Ages. Their particular brand of virtus or strength or power is a tool with which they're going to protect you, and it raises them closer to the holy ear, the ear of God, so that they can plead on your behalf to God. And so I don't think that young women were kneeling in front of, maybe somewhere probably, but leaning in front of Catherine in general and thinking, I too should be a great philosopher. What they were probably thinking was, she's really good at arguing. And like, I've done some stuff and like, I really want to go to heaven. And so I'm going to get Catherine on side, because with her amazing skills of argumentation, she's going to advocate for me at the divine court. And there's actually a story in Saints in which a very, very unfortunate pilgrim to the shrine of St. James I'm not going to say what he's done, but it's absolutely awful. He's done a terrible thing to himself. And he ends up actually dying of his injuries. And he gets taken by devils they're taken to hell. But then he gets redirected by St. James to a kind of heavenly version of the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome. And St. James, because this guy is a faithful pilgrim, St. James then does this, like full on argues in the tribunal, that's at the tribunal of heaven, argues for Gerald, this poor pilgrim, to be released from the devils. And he argues to the Virgin Mary, and she's sitting there kind of enthroned, listening. And so it's just I think, really excellent and interesting insight into this, like the secondary world building of the afterlife in the medieval Catholic imagination or Christian imagination. And so, yeah, I can imagine people kneeling in front of a rood screen with an image of St. Catherine or St. Barbara or St. Agnes, but especially St. Catherine, because she's really good at arguing, and imagining her pleading on their behalf. Oh, I did want to talk about Mary. I think she's a really important one because, I mean, she is like probably the most popular saint. Devotion to Mary in late medieval England and early modern England is through the roof. And something I was really interested in is the story of her, it's from the Apocryphal Gospel of Pseudo Matthew. And it says that she's riding to Bethlehem and she sees a date palm covered in dates. And she asks Joseph to pick some for her. And he says, he's a bit recalcitrant and says, that the one that got you pregnant, pick the dates, something along those lines. And the tree, recognizing that she's got the child of God in her womb, bows down so that she can pick her fill of dates. And this was reframed for an English audience with a cherry tree instead of a date palm. And it appears in the End Town plays. And Joseph is particularly kind of, let the one that got you pregnant pick the cherries. This is wild work. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go up a cherry tree. And the other thing that is because it's seasonal, that it's the idea that the cherries have set in midwinter. And so it is like a miraculous, unseasonal fruit. So then Mary's able to gather her fill. And I've got a whole chapter on cherries. I just became really obsessed with the symbolism of cherries in late medieval England. But there's an amazing panel, late medieval panel painting in Battle Hall now. It was from a Dominican priory convent, I think. And the underpaint, it shows several saints all in a row, these iconic super saints. In the middle is the Virgin. And it was recently conserved very thoroughly. And in the underdrawing, they found that the Virgin was going to be holding a lily. But in the painting, it was changed to a sprig of wild cherry with little cherries on it. So yeah, I won't go into the whole cherry thing because I'm really, really into the 15th century cherry thing. And if the Reformation hadn't happened, maybe we'd all still be obsessed with cherries as a symbol of abundance and life's riches, like life's free riches. I think that's what they come to symbolize. And the Virgin, I think there's a fantastic story that kind of gives an insight into maybe ordinary people's devotion. It's in the chapbook, or the commonplace book, I mean, of, what's he called? Robert Raines, I think his name is. And it's full of sort of everyday like accounts and things. But he's also put in like stories that he thinks are interesting or valuable. And he tells a story of a man who was completely besotted with the Virgin. Like he'd gone to school, he'd had an education, but all he could remember was the Hail Mary, the prayer. And he would just say it all the time. He was so devoted to her that when he died, a lily grew on his grave. and every leaf was inscribed Ave Maria. And the villagers are like a bit freaked out by this. And so they decide to dig down to find where this lily's growing from. And they dig deeper and deeper and deeper until they actually reach his corpse. And it's growing. The root is in his mouth. It's so weird. And amazing. There's this story of this this corpse of the lily root in his mouth because he said that Ave Maria prayer so much in his life. I don't think that's obviously a real true story, but the bit about it, I feel like it comes from, it could be a true story. Who knows? I won't go so far as to make that claim, but the bit that I think you can see glimmers of social history and is this idea of people just latching onto a prayer or latching onto a saint. And that bit, surely it's meant to be believable that there's people like that who are just always talking about the Virgin. Or there's another story that I retell in the book about Saint Martin, about a farmer who's always praying by Saint Martin. And then Saint Martin appears to him and grants him 4 wishes, like a kind of saintly genie. And it all goes horribly downhill. I'll leave that as a cliffhanger.
Oh, I love them. They're such amazing stories, aren't they? They really do tell us a lot about the time and the people. So on that note, what do these saints offer us in terms of insights into the medieval mind? Did you come up with any can you make any generalizations about that?
Yeah, well, I think sometimes when you study political history or you study history from, I don't know, you sometimes come across this kind of like, oh, well, they lost so many children. They were used to it. Or weren't they hilarious? Like Holy Grail kind of Monty Python representations of a bit absurd people. And it's like, they are like, there is hilarity because there's hilarity, whichever in all humans, and it carries on whatever period you're looking at. But I think one thing I found really touching was like reading, I didn't include Henry VI in the end, but I read various miracles to do with Henry VI. He was a popular cult, never canonized, but there were many, many reports of him saving children. And so this was by the later period, people generally made pilgrimage in thanks for a miracle that had already happened rather than going to receive a miracle. And so lots of the miracles reported at the shrine of Henry VI were to do with accidents that had happened and how he had then appeared or intervened or rescued. And many of them are an amazing catalogue of childhood accidents, everyday accidents, things like a little girl getting tangled up in a leather strap that was hanging from a door and sort of being asphyxiated by it, but then coming round when her mother prayed to Henry VI, or a child falling into a mill race and drowning, but then appearing to come back to life once they had been pulled out and on the bank, and various saints had been invoked, but then they invoked Henry VI, and then the child sort of resuscitates. But what you get portrayed in these stories is the grief of the parents and the terror and that moment of panic that you can't even look at too closely, actually. But it's real, and it's not, oh, well, we've got 14 more.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that's the genuine, the desire to find protection, to find talismans, to find safety, to have some agency in it. And so there's also, I think, something I was interested in was the line between magic and magical incantation or sort of religious magic and prayer in a more straightforward sense. I think prayer, theologically speaking, and I might be corrected on this, but it's an offering up. It's a relinquishment of control, for saying, please don't let this happen, but I can't impact on this. I just have to offer it up to something bigger than me. Or please, could this happen? But whereas the idea that you say certain words, you perform certain actions, and if you do it right, it will affect a change, a supernatural change. That's something that anthropologically, as I understand it, is perceived more as a magical practice. And so it's that perception of what kind of agency you have in relation to your actions. And so I think one of the things I found really interesting exploring this book is at an anthropological level, a lot of what medieval pilgrims and Christians at various levels within medieval society is practicing is probably more like religious magic and charms. And I found the colourfulness and the imagination and the symbolism and the objects and words that are associated with this kind of practice really just brilliant. And I think it gets seized by reformers and turned into and slurred with the word paganism, which I think lives on in our perception of medieval Christianity. But now I think most people think paganism is quite cool, or that idea is quite cool. So we've no longer got that reformer like, ugh, no, pagan, you know. But I think we still overstate it. To give an example, there's Saint Christopher, you know, look at my face and you won't die today. That's a good example. Another one is, well, maybe this is a bit more of a blurry one, but there's a really, one of my favorite pilgrim souvenirs was from the shrine of Thomas Becket, and there's one at the British Museum, and it's in the form of a little hollow cast peacock. It's all crumpled now, and it's got a hollow cylindrical base, which probably was designed for it to be stuck onto the top of a pilgrim's staff. And the peacock is kind of in the round, 3-dimensional, and its tail is held up and is open. And it's got a little hook on its chest, probably for suspending a Canterbury bell, because this was another very popular kind of pilgrim souvenir from Canterbury, was a little tiny bell made of tin. And the peacock has also got Thomas Becket standing on its back with his hand raised in blessing. You know, I think it's a really cool little collection of talismans. So you've got the bells ringing has in many cultures, and not just medieval Christian cultures, is a way of warding off evil spirits or thunderstorms. Bells in church towers rung during thunderstorms and that kind of thing. And the eyes of the peacock looking out at the road is kind of the idea of the many watching eyes. The peacock itself is a herald of danger, along with cockerels and other birds like that cry out at danger. And then the saint with his hand raised in blessing, also looking forward. When you had this on your staff with its little jingly bell, and you had the staff ahead of you on the road, all of those eyes and the saint's hand and the bell and the crying bird are all ahead of you as you walk home from Canterbury. I think it's the most camp and wonderful object. And it's got there are some other ones that maybe don't have the saint, that are just a cockerel or similar kind of meanings, I think. So I think you get from that the way in which there's an earnestness to the quest for protection and for having some kind of control over the vicissitudes of life, but also a joy and a kind of creative humor and an aesthetic delight in creating those forms of protection that I think is also very human and very relatable.
Yeah, it really is. And given how integral saints were and everything that you've spoken about, and the fact that they were everywhere, as you say, you know, I'm thinking of jewels that have the Catherine wheel and things that people wore and all that kind of thing. What impact then does the Reformation have on saints, the cult of saints, and on the people as well?
Yes, I mean, so one of the things that's a big deal in the Reformation is whether images are being worshipped as images, whether it's idolatrous or not. And there's these stories of iconoclasts sticking pins in images to see if they bleed. And it's not just an idea that there's something theoretically wrong with worshipping an image, but that the act of idolatry creates a space for a devil to move in. I think that was an interesting revelation from writing this book, is that idolatry creates a diabolical vacuum. It's not just about the holiness no longer being there. And this is something that crops up throughout the book, is the presence of demons, the threat of demons. You know, so like people like Thomas More and Erasmus Desiderius, who are not, Thomas More is obviously, he's out and out Catholic, doesn't want reform. Desiderius Erasmus is a bit more, he's not a reformer, but he's a bit more kind of middle of the road. But they're saying, oh, come on, what's the harm? You know, there's a shrine in Picardy where Valerie, she's said to cure people of genital illnesses. And so there's just loads of wax willies hanging all around the shrine. You know, sorry to use a really silly word. I think it's alliterative, so I had to. And vulvas hanging all around this saint's shrine. And Thomas More, he kind of writes about it quite satirically, but he's also like, you know, there's also a ring at the shrine that men can put their gear through, as it's called in the text, and then it gets prayed over if they've got issues. So, and this is laughed at in by the text, but it's also then said like, oh, come on, what's wrong with that? Whereas reformers are saying it's dangerous. It makes space for the devil. And I think what's quite interesting, what I find quite like an interesting question as a sort of cliffhanger at the end of the book is, and there's lots more, this isn't a big spoiler or anything, but just what taking away all of that color and all of that protection and all of those symbols and ideas and stories, but not taking the devil away. What this is something that's like many other scholars have asked, is what does that leave people with to protect themselves. And it's interesting. My other half is a carpenter and a conservation carpenter, and a lot of the buildings that he works in have those daisy wheels and, you know, the apotropaic symbols scratched above fireplaces, but they only really appear from the post-Reformation period, in the post-Reformation period. And so there's this kind of like, this interesting scrabbling for new permissible means to protect yourself. And maybe there aren't any. And so that's, I think, an impact of this suppression. Another one is just the loss of all of these stories that I think we tend now to associate saints' legends, because the Catholic faith lives on, and because the cult of saints lives on in countries within Catholic communities and Catholic countries. Maybe we think that in the secular West, or in the Anglican West, or in whatever form of wherever you live or whatever you believe, that we have no claim to these stories. But actually, many of the saints that I discuss in my book are no longer perceived as legitimate saints by the Catholic Church, that you can celebrate their feast days, but they're all legend. They've got no historical basis. Saint Christopher being one of them. And many of them are so, or others, that the sort of local dimension to their legend is irrelevant or something. So what I'm hoping to achieve with this book is to invite people to see saints' legends, wherever they've come from, as part of their own heritage, and the heritage of storytelling, of human storytelling, and related to and part of the same world as folklore and fairy tale and myth.
Well, thank you. I think you've given us so much food for thought, and you've certainly inspired me to become more familiar with these legends and stories. So I appreciate it. There's one more thing that we do on Talking Tudors at the end, and that is what I call 10 to go. So these are just 10 little questions to get to know you a little bit better. That's all right. So the first one is, do you have a favorite historic site that you like to visit?
When I grew up in Gloucestershire. I was raised Catholic on my mum's side of the family, and Anglican on my dad's side of the family, and we'd alternate churches. And the Anglican church that we went to was St. Mary's in Great Wickham, Little Wickham even. And it's a 12th century church with later additions in a big valley, because that's what Wickham means, wide valley. And it's got a little stream running past it. And it's a gorgeous little English country church. And on the side of the hill, Cooper's Hill, that overlooks that part of the valley, there's the remains of a Roman villa called Wickham Roman Villa. And I mean, I just have fond memories of it anyway, because it was where I grew up. And so I remember cycling up towards the Roman villa on a really lovely summer's day. And I was wearing a summer's dress on the day that there was a Roman reenactment happening. And all of these local men were marching up the hill behind me, and they were heckling in the sweetest way, like, "Come on, boys!" And I was like, and it was really fun. So I have just happy associations with that. And they were all there in their flannels and armor, and the villa itself, just the way it looks out over. I just imagine, it had baths, it has a bit of a mosaic, and it was abandoned, I think, in the 4th, 5th century, as many were. And I imagine that St. Mary's is built on the site of an probably an early medieval church, early in the 12th century. And then probably before that, if we take the letter Mellitus got from Gregory the Great, to have been maybe a reflection of what was happening across the country, then maybe there was a Roman temple, place of worship down by that little stream. It kind of makes sense that you can see the church from the villa. And maybe when the Roman people were there, the Romano-British occupants of that villa were there, they were looking down at some kind of structure for their worship. I really like getting an insight into networks and connections and a sense of a continuum of the past. And I think the historical sites that inspire me the most are the ones where you can join the dots in that way. There's also the cool thing about that villa, and I don't know if this is completely ahistorical, and an expert in snails can let me know, but there's about 3 miles further round the escarpment of hills there's a colony of Roman snails, of escargot snails, like the really big ones, and they're protected there. And I don't know whether, because the Romans ate snails, right? So I don't know whether the Romans brought those snails, and in typical snail fashion, they've only managed to go about 2 miles from the villa in 2,000 years. And now they're like, "Oh, this will do." So anyway, it's those links. There's also around the villa walnut trees growing, and I believe that walnuts were a favorite food of the Romans. I don't think the trees are 2,000 years old, but what if, what if they are the great, 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 great grandchildren of walnuts brought by that Roman community? So anyway, I like those. That's an amazing place. Little Wickham and the Roman Villa and the Church of St. Mary's and the snails and the walnut trees.
Oh, I love it. I love all of that, all those layers of history. So I can see so many wonderful books behind you. So what is the last book, or maybe one that you're currently reading? So last book that you read, or one that you're currently reading?
I just read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. I was just really, a friend said, oh, we should read that. And I was like, yeah, I never even thought about that. I think I associate the kind of stuff around Mary Magdalene a bit too much with much more recent Holy Grail speculation type thing. And so I was like, well, I don't know how historical that is. But then I actually realized, it is a papyrus, it's preserved on ancient papyrus scrolls. And there's a translation by somebody whose name I've forgotten, Karen. We'll have to put it up at the end of the podcast, but she's a Harvard professor, and she gives a sort of early Christian setting for this time when the Gospels hadn't yet been chosen for the official Bible, when it's all still in discussion, when how much of Judaic scripture ended up in the Bible was still a subject for debate, and the politics around that at the time, and how Christianity inherited a lot of Greco-Roman thought and philosophy, especially Neoplatonism. And the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, it's amazing. She's standing there after the resurrection, and the disciples are all in confusion. And I think it's Andrew says to her, like, you were closest disciple to Christ. Could you tell us anything? Does he tell you anything to explain what's going on? And so she then stands there and sort of gives a speech about this private conversation she had with Christ, and she explains it. And it uses very different kind of language from what we're used to in the Gospels. And it's much more Platonic, much more Gnostic. It's much more about a kind of genderless God. And so fascinating. She kind of says, and it's also quite just comforting to read now. She says, don't listen to people who say, look that way or look this way. She says, you've got it within you. And it's a really inspiring and quite surprising read.
Yeah, I love that. Actually, here's a little tidbit. So Jane Seymour associated herself with Mary Magdalene because she didn't have a name saint, poor Jane. So she went for Mary Magdalene. So there you go.
That's so interesting. My confirmation name was Mary Magdalene. So she's and the Golden Legend story for Mary Magdalene is absolutely fantastic. I don't include her in saints, but I would really urge readers to get a copy of Jacobus de Voragine's Golden Legend and read the Mary Magdalene chapter, because it's super kind of horrifying and interesting.
That sounds amazing. And what about an ideal Sunday morning for you? What does that look like?
Oh, well, I currently have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. I would really like to sleep till 6, if that's all right. Till at least 6 a.m. would be really nice. And then probably walk out on somewhere where there are absolutely no words, quite enough words in my life.
No writing. Okay, great. And do you have a new skill that you would like to learn?
Oh dear. I'd really like to learn gymnastics. But people who ever teach it to 7-year-olds.
Yeah, you could do it. You could do some lessons.
Yeah. Well, I don't need a private gymnastics tutor. I took my daughter to a place that that does is a gymnastics center near here, and I went up to these young girls that are kind of manning the door, not yet, like teenage girls, clearly gymnasts at the place, and I was like, do you do lessons for adults? And they were like, no, sorry, never mind.
And what about in terms of inspiration? What inspires you, or how do you find inspiration if you're feeling a little bit uninspired?
Start writing something, because quite often it gets interesting. I find, I don't know, I've sort of hit a seam of inspiration with medieval primary sources and chronicles and later stuff, as well. And I right now I can rely on that. Like if I've got my head into a place, I find, and I hope that listeners will identify with this, and I just don't sound like a psychopath, but I find looking after children challenging. I love it and I feel blessed, but there's also a lot of stewing time in your own head. And if you tell them what's going on in your head, they really don't care. And as you don't bother with that, and little things can grow. And you can also just, when one of them's watching something, the other one's asleep, you just sort of, oh, what shall I do for 2 minutes? Oh, I'll go on social media. And I think you can sort of going back to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, you can sort of find yourself looking this way, looking that way, getting swept up in superficial things. And nothing like sorts that out for me more than being alone for an hour and writing something, just writing a version of something. That's why I quite like the retelling thing, because a lot of these old stories don't explain their characters' motivations. And so just, it's like doing a crossword.
Yeah.
And so you can kind of take the map of the plot that the text gives you and kind of try and make sense of it, try and make it beautiful as well. Or to kind of like, how would you pen that? You know, if it's a poem, how would you turn it into prose and retain its kind of aura of mystery? That's something it takes me out of my own head and I find profoundly inspiring.
Yeah, that's the key, isn't it? Get out of our minds for a little while, our thoughts. So as a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
A butcher. I just had this idea that I would be a complete femme fatale. I thought I was going to be 6 foot tall, and I was going to wear, I can remember imagining myself in fishnets and red stilettos.
Wow.
Because that's what I thought sexy women wore. And I can remember imagining sitting at a bar, having like a cocktail, and somebody coming over and being like, so what do you do? And me being like, butcher. And I just thought that would be really, really alluring.
I love that. I've never had that response before. There's never been butcher, so that's the first time for everything. And what about a country that maybe you haven't seen that you would like to travel to?
I would love, does it have to be real?
No, let's go with the not real one. I like that.
I'd quite like to go to like the earthly paradise that St. Brendan finds on his voyage. Although there's a really funny, so I think actually it's even on the Hereford Mappa Mundi, there is an island off the coast of West Africa called St. Brendan's Isle, and it's put there. And it's kind of in the place of the Canary Islands. So maybe I've actually already went on a cruise ship there once. But, you know, it's like somewhere where the rain never falls, but only bubbles up from the ground, and the trees are always fruiting, and there's like iridescent panthers. But the cool thing is, like, there's a depiction of St. Brendan's Isle on the first ever globe. I talk about it in this book. And what I find really funny, so I'm quarter Austrian, and in Austria, we don't call potatoes Kartoffel, as people from Germany who speak German do. We call them Erdapfel, so earth apples. But this map, this first ever globe depiction of the Earth was made in, I think, the late 14th century, I want to say. And it was known as the Erdapfel globe. But it was before potatoes had come to Europe. So they didn't realize that they had given it, and it just means earth apple. They called it the earth apple globe because it looked like an apple. But they unwittingly made it really funny for the rest of human history, because then quite soon the potato arrived and really took the rug out from under the seriousness of their beautiful globe. St. Brendan's Isle.
Brendan's Isle, wonderful, love it. And very last thing, I ask all my guests for a takeaway. Normally it's a Tudor takeaway, but I'm more than happy for this to be a saint takeaway or a story takeaway. And it's something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So sometimes people give websites or books to read or songs to listen to. So do you have a takeaway for us?
Go and visit your nearest St. Christopher. Look on his face. I bet no one's ever more than a few miles away from a St. Christopher, especially close in England and Wales.
Absolutely. I'm going to be on the lookout now for St. Christopher everywhere. Amy, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. Your book sounds absolutely fascinating, and I cannot wait to read all those amazing stories. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was utter joy. Thank you. Loved it.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.